starts now.
Welcome back to the podcast. So we like to tell the truth on the program. I never thought I'd live in a period of time where I actually had to tell an audience that I prefer the truth, but the truth is just optional these days in so many areas. So we've got a professor of law and science policy, health law and science policy from the University of Alberta, and he is known hither and yon for his radio appearances, his TV shows. He's done a marvelous show on Netflix, and it's all about the truth. And so before we do anything else, Professor Tim Caulfield at the University of Alberta, welcome back. Thank you very much for being in my life and being in my professional life.
Thanks for having me on, Charles. Really looking forward to this.
So I wanted to begin by simply asking you the question that relates to my brief remarks. Did you ever think, whether it was in high school, university, at any stage in your life, did you ever think that you could make a living and have a big brand across the world just for espousing truth?
No, is the short answer. I've been doing this for almost 3 decades. I've been working in this space, and I never thought it was going to get this bad. It really is remarkable. And to be honest with you, Charles, even 4 or 5 years ago, so before the pandemic, even after Trump, 2016 is often given as sort of the starting point of this current age of untruth. I didn't think it would be as bad as it is now, where you have such a large percentage of the population, yes, primarily in the United States, but it's happening here in Canada too, such a large percentage of the population embracing things that are demonstrably false. And the classic example now is in the United States, depending on what survey you look at, 60 to 70% of Republican voters believe the big lie, right? And this is a lie. It's not a people of reputable backgrounds, disputing facts. This is something that, flat earth kind of lie. You have, huge percentages of Canadians open to the idea that the COVID vaccines had microchips in them. Again, depending on what survey that you look at, anywhere between 20 to 30%, huge percentages of Canadians believing that the vaccine killed more individuals than COVID. It's just stunning. And the other aspect, Charles, that I find fascinating is the degree now, and also worrisome. I'm always an optimist. I've been on your show before. I'm an optimist. One of the things that's making me a little more pessimistic is the degree to which this has become about ideology, right? It really has become so incredibly linked to ideology. And yes, it's largely coming from one quarter of the ideological spectrum now. But that's this cultural moment. It hasn't always been like that, and we can come back to that. I think it's important to reflect on the degree to which this is a cultural moment where it's coming largely from, and yes, there's good empirical independent research to back this up, largely coming from the right at this point. But this is in the past, it's come more from the left. So it's important to recognize that.
So just before we started this conversation, I'm looking at this clip of Pierre Poilievre in the 905 area code in Ontario, door knocking with a candidate, and a woman comes to the door, and it was clearly set up because this was well mic'd, so he knew that the mic was on, the camera was on, and I guess it's set up with a conservative voter, and she starts out by telling him that Pierre Trudeau ruined the country. I mean, you're living in Alberta; you can hear that on any street corner, almost anywhere in the province of Alberta and elsewhere, of course, but primarily in Alberta. And so as soon as she babbles the stuff about how Pierre Trudeau ruined the country, Pierre Poilievre responds with, yes, he and his son are Marxists. And I'm just wondering, if it wasn't for the big lie about, how the election wasn't really lost by Donald Trump, how he won the election, you started out by talking about the big lie. If it wasn't for the big lie and so many other big lies, do you think there's a chance that someone who actually aspires to be prime minister would be knocking on doors and telling Canadians that Pierre Trudeau and his son are Marxists? I mean, I just wonder how deep the deceit has gone.
No, to answer your question, no, I think that we're living in this era where there's incredible tolerance for misinformation, for tolerance for conspiracy theories, and tolerance for lies. And I think that has made room for it's enabled individuals to say ridiculous things like that. And look, you don't have to be a fan of Trudeau. You can be critical of his government. And is he a Marxist? No. Is there any evidence that he, espouses to these Marxists? And it's almost comical in a way. The Liberals are sort of the centrist government, a minority government, and he's held up by the haters as if he's some kind of dictator. Which, look, you don't have to be a fan of him. I'm critical of many of his policies, but that's how that kind of framing and that kind of assertion is given room now, I think, because we live in this age of untruth, or this post-truth era, where you're supposed to give room to and these kinds of absurdity.
So I could play the game, I guess, that many media people play, and say, well, Pierre Poilievre is just giving one side of the story. He's saying that Pierre Trudeau and Justin Trudeau are Marxists, and other people like Timothy Caulfield and Charles Adler say he isn't. But both these positions should be weighed equally. Both sidesism. Timothy Caulfield, what do you think of both sidesism?
An incredibly frustrating, damaging phenomenon. I'll put it that way. I was trying to think of a kind word to frame it, because it's total BS, really. And we're seeing more and more of it. And as you know, it's really a version of false balance. And as a journalist, that false balance is a concern that's been around really for decades, probably centuries. And it's this idea that you're supposed to give both sides of an argument, no matter what the evidence says, sort of equal weight. And we know that false balance can do real harm. There have been a lot of interesting studies with climate change, with vaccines, with GMOs, that have shown that false balance can have a really adverse impact on public perceptions and policy discussions. We've done research on this ourselves. And that's what we're seeing more and more of. And the problem is, it's not just coming from the media. It's being generated by social media, right? And by political positioning of issues. So an issue like vaccines becomes, especially in the United States, but increasingly here in Canada, is becoming an ideological topic now. And who would have guessed that? A topic that should be informed solely by the evidence has become an ideological issue. And that creates this both sidism. And what we need to do is push back against that with an approach that embraces the weight of evidence. So what does the weight of evidence say on this topic, right? What does the weight of evidence say about climate change, about safety of GMOs, about vaccines, or even political topics like is Trudeau a Marxist? But we don't seem to do that anymore. And if you espouse that position, Charles, you are it's asserted that you are trying to censor people, that you are trying to silence an important perspective, when that's not the case at all. And if I may, I know I'm going on for a bit, I'm quite passionate about this. One of the things I find frustrating is you hear that counter to the idea of, oh, we shouldn't allow false balance all the time. And what I find so ironic about it is those who are saying they've been silenced, that there's censorship, are often saying it on the world's most popular podcast, 100 million listeners, or they're saying it on the most popular cable news show, that they've been silenced. And almost any of the topics that you can outline, and I've named some of them already, there hasn't been any silencing. On the contrary, these perspectives have been overrepresented in pop culture. They haven't been silenced. They're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere. And in addition to that, they've been studied and studied and studied and studied, probably studied too much, right? And been shown to be wrong, but the evidence is ignored and the both sidism continues.
Never apologize for being passionate about anything, Professor Caulfield. And one of the reasons I'm passionate about this false equivalence, false balance issue is because when I was young, perhaps too young, because of what happened to my ancestors, I studied authoritarianism. You cannot have authoritarianism, whether it's Nazism, communism. You can't have any of these sick, disgusting isms without promoting false balance, without promoting the big lie, without promoting the idea that there is an equivalent between vaccines are helpful to prevent people from becoming really sick with COVID, and then saying vaccines are killing people, and then declaring that they're both morally equal positions, that kind of false balance. Can you explain to us from a professor's perspective and an author's perspective what the linkage is between authoritarianism and this idea of both sidesism, why it's so helpful when you're trying to build an authoritarian culture?
Well, it does a lot of things. And I think as a lead to that question, I think it's important to note the degree to which the topics which we see the most false balance, the most both sidisms are almost always topics that have become politicized, right? We don't hear about false balance so much when you're talking about the Bernoulli effect that makes airplanes fly, right? No one's sort of concerned about having, the flying carpet expert versus the aeronautical engineer discussing flight. People accept the scientific consensus in most domains in our life. We accept the scientific consensus, recognizing that science always evolves and that we have to give respected minority positions their due, and we need to always scientifically challenge conventional wisdom. Everyone knows that, right? But we accept their scientific consensus about important topics that inform our personal decisions and they inform policy. But when a topic becomes politicized, we invite both side-isms and false balance into the equation. And if you push back against that, you're silencing. So it does for an authoritarian regime, it does a couple of things, right? And by the way, there's really interesting research to back up exactly what you've said, Charles. And in countries that lean more towards authoritarianism, and increasingly that includes the United States, you see more misinformation, you see more acceptance of misinformation. And there's some really recent research that shows that can even happen sort of on the micro level, where there are authoritarian leaders in companies where the leader of the company has a more authoritarian ethos. More that members of that company are more likely to embrace misinformation. You want to destabilize the truth. And that's one of the reasons that you see it emerge all the time. You want to doubt monger. You want to create uncertainty. You want to create fear and anxiety. That makes room for, right? That makes room for the voice and the perspective of the authoritarian leader, be it in a company or be it at the level of the nation state.
If I constantly yammer about the prime minister being a Marxist, and let's just be clear about that. If I accuse him of being the kind of person who wants to ban many, many freedoms that Marxists would ban, including the freedom to own private property, including the freedom for the government to seize your private property, whether it's your home, your business, your car, your gold watch, whatever it is the government wants to take from you, the government can confiscate everything from you because the government essentially owns your life. So that's a loose definition of Marxism. If I can convince a critical mass of Canadians that this prime minister is indeed a Marxist, that he wants to take away everything that you have and everything that you own, am I not enabling those people who want to advocate for the violent overthrow of the government?
Well, I can think the short answer is yes, but we don't even need to go to that kind of extreme, right, Charles? We saw that obviously what happened in the United States, right, with January 6th. So it may sound like you're using hyperbole here, but we saw it play out to a degree in the United States with January 6th for the exact reasons that we've talked about, right, Charles? But in addition to that, all you need to do is create create doubt. So there was a really interesting study from the United States that again came out very, very recently, last couple of weeks, that talked about, the degree to which Americans still believe misinformation about so many things, right? And generally speaking, I'm going to overgeneralize here. The rates were somewhere between 30 and 40% of people believed misinformation. I'll even say less than that. Let's say 15 to 25% really believed misinformation about gun control aspects, COVID stuff, climate change, all. But what the researchers noted is that what they found the most scary was the number of people that just were uncertain. Right, Charles? So you have this middle hunk where there's like 40% of the population that's kind of uncertain about these things. If you can just create doubt about stuff, right? It makes it easier to, are you gonna vote for Trudeau or not? Well, I heard the stuff about him being a Marxist. I don't know if it's true or not, but that sounds scary. If you can just introduce that doubt, it can have a real impact on people's beliefs and behavior. And I think that we're seeing that increasingly. I think in the past, what you would have seen is more certainty, right? Where people would go, no, that's not true. And then you have sort of those hardcore people on the other side that said, well, it is true. But unfortunately, sort of that uncertain middle is growing, and it's growing because of the power and the rhetoric that it's emanating from those pushing conspiracy theories and misinformation.
Are we at a crazy point in this country, Professor Caulfield, where some people refuse to give shots to their own dogs? I'm talking about rabies shots. I'm talking about a situation where it's not COVID that I'm talking about now, but that we could have actually a breakout of rabies in Canada because people refuse to give their animals shots. I mean, is that really happening, or is that just kind of a story that's out there being promoted by people who want to create mischief?
That's really happening. And, I'm familiar with the researchers who did this. It's funny because I posted about this on some of my social media platforms a few days ago, and some people thought it was like a hoax. This can't be real. But it's so real. And as I said, I'm familiar with the researchers who did it, and they actually, reached out to me after I posted it. So there's interesting research. And by the way, this builds on research that's been done in the past. It's kind of replicating other research. There's a growing number, and we're talking a huge hunk in the United States. About 50% of people in the United States are now uncertain whether they should give their pets vaccines. It's a spillover from the misinformation that emanated around COVID vaccines, right? So they just created sort of this general hesitancy about vaccines for themselves, and now increasingly for their pets, even around things, as you point out, like the rabies vaccines. And I think it's 40% of pet owners in the United States are worried that vaccines will give their dogs autism. So that's where we are, the scientific absurdity of that 40%, Charles. And that is a direct result of the spread of misinformation, sort of the tolerance of pseudoscience, and the tolerance of both sidesism. And I think it's also important to note, really important to note, that this is happening with human vaccines too, where you're seeing an increasing percentage of parents who are more hesitant about childhood vaccinations. So we're talking about the potential that not just the potential, this is going to kill people. I think that, again, it sounds like I'm being hyperbolic, but I'm not. I think it's clear that this is going to have extremely adverse impact on vaccination rates, and then people are going to die, including kids.
So, if Canadian moms and dads don't want to give their kids a measles vaccine for all the reasons that you've just stated, buying into the big lie that the measles vaccine can create autism in a child, are we now flirting with the idea of a measles epidemic in Canada or any other country where this kind of philosophy is taking root?
Well, we are. And I think that there are epidemiologists. Well, first of all, we've seen it happen, right? We've seen it play out in sort of on a smaller scale in locations in the United States where there's low vaccination rates. So you absolutely see measles outbreaks. And the concern is this is going to grow, right? It's going to grow from just these relatively isolated situations to a broader outbreak. And people often go, oh, well, measles, I had it when I was a kid. It's not a big deal. It kills, tens of thousands of kids every year in the world, Charles. it is a disease that can kill children and have long-term consequences for their health. And I think people just see that, the majority of the people have the measles and they recover, and then they have a degree of immunity. But this is a disease that we know can kill and have serious health consequences. In addition to that, we know the vaccine is extremely effective here. So you really are taking a decision that can have adverse impact for yourself and for your community. And I also think it's important to highlight the degree to which this is about ideology, right? Consistently, this shows that those who hold these kinds of views about vaccines are generally speaking of a particular ideological leaning. If you could give me a moment, I'm going to give you a really good example of the degree to which this is about ideology. So Marin County in California, I don't know if you've been there, Charles. It's a beautiful part of the world.
It includes, just so people know, Marin County includes San Francisco.
Yeah, it's just outside San Francisco, right? Over the Golden Gate Bridge. I have a friend who lives there, Jen Gunter. I've been, it's gorgeous. And it is extremely democratic, extremely liberal, extremely educated, very, very affluent, as you can imagine. These are not cheap homes we're talking about here. Before the pandemic, Charles, Marin County was one of the most unvaccinated places in the United States. And you can imagine it's, yoga, it's, new agey, and people were not getting vaccinated for a particular reason. The pandemic happens, being unvaccinated becomes an ideological flag, largely for the Republican Party, for the GOP, right, in the United States. It becomes this flag, right? And presto, Marin County becomes one of the most vaccinated places in the United States. So, and I think this is really important to highlight, right? Because it really speaks to the degree to which this is about ideology. This is about personal brands. So you have this group of affluent, educated, intelligent people not vaccinating. Hey, I don't want to be viewed as a Republican anymore. Presto, I'm getting vaccinated. So I think that is both depressing and also very, very telling.
Professor Timothy Caulfield, you're talking about Marin County, and you're talking about human intelligence. You're talking about essentially what I see as a war on the human mind. Now, this has been taking place for a number of years. We referred earlier to authoritarianism, which is always about disparaging the so-called elites, starting out with the intellectual elites, if you don't mind me putting it this way. People like yourself and Jen Gunter, who you mentioned earlier, maybe some of your other friends in Marin County and elsewhere. Do you believe in your intellect, and never mind your heart of hearts, but in your intellect, based on your research, do you believe that there is a war on right now around the world against people who have education? Do you believe there's a war on the educated mind on this planet?
I will say I think there's definitely an information war that is being waged. I think there is a war being waged on science and the scientific process in order to create doubt. And we know this because there's evidence of that state actors are involved. So I guess it depends on your definition of war. But we know that there are countries around the world that are using social media and other means to create information chaos, right? And Charles, that's the goal, right? They may not have a particular even agenda. Sometimes they do, and there's evidence to back that up. But sometimes they're just trying to create information chaos. And it's very, unfortunately, we also know it's very, very effective. So I do think that this is the case, and we're also seeing, particular parties that are political parties that are using the same means to create doubt on important topics, to create mistrust, and I think this is really important to highlight, and isn't stated enough. Because I fight misinformation. It's one of the things that I do research on, and I feel very passionate about it, and I'll talk about perhaps to the general public or in the media, for people with people like you, or on social media. And often what I get back from the public is, well, of course, misinformation is spreading because we can't trust institutions anymore. Institutions have been bought out. They can't be trusted, whether you're talking about healthcare institutions, research institutions, the judiciary, political leaders. And I think it's really important to highlight that those who are pushing misinformation, the misinformation mongers, I often call them, their goal is to create distrust, right? That's the agenda, right? So people distrust institutions in part, not entirely, but in part because the misinformation that is spreading has caused them to distrust institutions, which makes room for more misinformation. Now, I want to pause here and say, yes, there are often completely legitimate reasons for distrust in institutions, especially historically. There are communities, the Indigenous communities in Canada, that have completely legitimate reasons for distrusting institutions. And there are other examples. But I think we shouldn't forget that so much of the distrust that exists right now exists because of the spread of misinformation. And in fact, Charles, this is something that we want to study. We've put in a couple of grants where we want to get empirical evidence to back up what I've just said. And I have anecdotal evidence that this is the case. Whenever someone tells me, well, I can't trust an institution, I can't trust the FDA, I can't trust Health Canada, I can't trust the Public Health Agency of Canada, the reason they don't trust them is based on misinformation, right? They lied about the vaccines. They lied about the value of public health measures. That, I think, is often lost because it's almost like we're giving in to the misinformation mongers when we accept the idea that the distrust is completely legitimate. Now, again, I want to be careful. This is nuanced. It's complex, and we have to listen to why people distrust institutions. We have to make trustworthy institutions. We have to make them better. We have to learn, and we have to improve. But we can't forget the role of misinformation in the creation of distrust.
Timothy Caulfield is a Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy. He's a professor in the Faculty of Law and the School of Public Health and Research at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. Dr. Caulfield, Professor Caulfield, excuse me, I promised I wouldn't call you doctor because I know that doctor just encourages the trolls to go after you. But doctor has become a bad word in Alberta and some other parts of the world. I get that. So my apologies if I slip and call you doctor as I have for the last number of years. Professor Caulfield, help us understand something here. How difficult is it to bring about distrust in institutions when you have access to a media camera, a media microphone, and you can take anything that, I'll just use the example of a Dr. Fauci. You can use anything that Dr. Fauci says on a Monday in January, compare it to a Monday in March when things have changed surrounding the pandemic. There's new information, and clearly his message may be different in March than it was in January. How difficult is it for me as a media manipulator to say, well, you see, here is why you cannot trust Tony Fauci?
Yeah, and I get that message every day. Every day someone sends me some version of what you've just said. So a couple things here. Let's start with the legitimate concerns. Early days in the pandemic, the messaging wasn't ideal. There was some dogmatism to some of the statements that were made. Not all of them, but there was some dogmatism, and there's reasons for that. When you are in the midst of a pandemic, you turn to what are the best practices for public health messaging, and one of them is speak with certainty, give actionable advice. And I think it's fair to say that early days mistakes were made, and we need to recognize that we have to be explicit about the scientific uncertainty and say, to the best of our knowledge right now, this is our advice. And I think that things got better as the pandemic played out. But you see this kind of sort of quote cherry picking happening on several topics, masks, the role of vaccines, where the pandemic started. And they manipulate the narrative in order to make it seem like there was some kind of conspiracy or that the voice simply can't be trusted. Now, someone like Fauci, there's thousands and thousands of quotes, so they take one, and there might have been, 999 on the topic where he's more nuanced, and they take that one quote and they sort of weaponize it, right? Anecdotally, it happens to me all the time. I'm sure it happens to you, Charles. And they take your quote out of context and they spin it. The lab leak theory is a really good example of that. Early days, there was sort of overstatement about the lab leak. It's a conspiracy theory if you say it's the lab leak. And part of that was because the lab leak was being pushed by sort of hardcore conspiracy theorists, right? And so we're talking, early 2020. But if you actually, and I've done this, you look at the public narrative coming from officials, really from December 2020 on, it was more nuanced. That's completely forgotten, right? You compare 2020 to the ambiguity. Oh my gosh, Charles, I haven't had enough coffee yet today.
Ambiguity.
Thank you. To the uncertainty that we have today, right, around the lab leak. And it looks like there was something afoot, right? Something afoot, which is, really unfair. So I think that then layer on top of that AI, where you can just create images and create sound bites out of thin air. There's an interesting study that came out, I'm going to say 2 weeks ago, that found that most educators, up to 50% educators, could not tell when a video had been manipulated or wholly created by AI, just to give you a sense of how challenging the future is going to be.
So when we hear all of this, it is natural for a person to ask the question, when are things going to get better? Can't you guys give us a solution? Those kinds of questions come up. So how the heck, there's an academic word for you. How the heck, Professor Tim Caulfield, do we have any idea when things will turn around? And can we blame people who are on the cynical side who think, well, it's bound to get a lot worse before it gets better? What are your thoughts?
I can't blame them at all for being a little bit pessimistic. As I said earlier, I'm always an optimist, glass half full. So let's talk about the reasons we can be optimistic about things getting better. I think this issue is being taken very, very seriously now. We even heard the UN saying we need an international action on this. Virtually every nation state now, every leader recognizes that the spread of misinformation, especially in the OECD countries, recognize that the spread of misinformation is a serious, serious problem that needs to be addressed. The other reason I think that there's some cause for optimism is that we have more and more research on this. We have bigger and better studies exploring what strategies work, what strategies don't work. And the other reason is, despite what you often hear, and often this is a false balance problem, most people, even in the United States, Charles, think that we need to take steps to deal with misinformation. There's an interesting study that was published by Pew that found that 65%, this is really shocking data, I think, 65% of Americans think that battling misinformation is more important than freedom of expression. Think about that, right? And you never hear that. You don't hear that from the GOP. You don't hear that. And to be honest with you, I'm not even sure if I agree with it. But that gives you a sense of how many people in the United States, where freedom of expression, as you know, is like, paramount social value. Even there, they recognize. So those are reasons to be optimistic, right? We are figuring out how to move forward. Reasons to be pessimistic, we've touched on them. The ideology problem. Whenever misinformation becomes about ideology, it becomes more difficult to change people's minds. It becomes more difficult to actually challenge it, because then you hear the censorship, silencing kind of rhetoric. So I think that's a problem, reason to be pessimistic. And the other one is AI. Holy cow, AI is going to make this really, really tough. And I'm going to add one more, if I might. The platforms themselves, social media platforms, have not been as aggressive and as open to fighting these issues as we would like to see, as we need. And I want to emphasize on the freedom of expression thing, because I often get, Caulfield wants to censor people. Go through my feeds, go through the stuff I've written. I've never advocated censorship. I'm a strong believer in freedom of expression. I think even something like deplatforming should be an instrument of last resort and should only be implemented after transparent rules have been, infringed again and again, right? Everyone knows the rules, and this individual's, or entity has gone over those rules again and again. In fact, I think what we want to use, the first tools should always be tools that are really part of our information environment. And that are things like debunking, pre-bunking, using social media platforms to highlight when misinformation is being spread. Let's use those evidence-informed strategies first, and the more sort of aggressive regulatory tools after. I do believe in regulatory tools being used a bit more aggressively when you're talking about professionals, because holding a professional to a standard of care is not censorship, right? That is like trying to create a standard of care. But don't play the censorship card when you know that it's just a rhetorical tool.
Professor Caulfield, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you an uncomfortable question. Why haven't you written at least a dozen books?
It takes time. I'm editing my latest right now. I'm hoping that the next one will be out in 2024, early 2024, and I touch on a lot of the things that we've talked about today.
Give us a quick summation of your most recent book, because I think it would be unfair to leave the audience without the impression that you can probably get it on Amazon tonight, and it's important that you do that.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, the book, I'm fairly certain it's going to be called The Certainty Illusion. And I really talk about the way our information environment is rigged to lie to us in so many different ways. And I take on the research environment and all the problems with the research environment. I take on the degree to which the opinion information environment has been twisted. So everything from ratings on social media to how the news media has been twisted. So I try to look at all those things, and as always, Charles, I try to inject a little bit of fun and entertainment into the book too.
The Certainty of Illusion. Dr. Timothy Caulfield, a Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy, a professor at the University of Alberta, and a good friend of this broadcaster/podcaster. Dr. Caulfield, looking forward to our next visit.
Thanks so much, Charles.
Timothy Caulfield is in Edmonton. I just want to remind people that if you don't have time to hear the entire show, you can catch it on demand on your favorite podcast app. I don't care whether you go to Apple, or Spotify, Google, any of them. Check us out. Tell your friends all about us. And post whatever you feel like posting on X, Twitter, as it was once called, Facebook, or anywhere else. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Charles Adler.
Catch Charles Adler Mondays on Real Talk with Ryan Jesperson, twice a week in the Winnipeg Free Press, and every day at Crier Media.